Greg, thank you so very much for your introduction, for all of you to remain after lunch. That means you're really serious, and we need serious citizens right now. Mayor Henry, thank you so very much for being here and for your warm welcome, but also for your leadership, which is so critical to progress across our vast, vast watershed. I wanted to also acknowledge the video of Senator Joe Donnelly, a dear friend from his years in the House of Representatives, and he is so well placed to help us in the Senate where we need Great Lakes members to measure up. I am really happy that all of you are here on behalf of the Tri-State Watershed Alliance, and I wanted to say that I came here with a revolutionary idea to a revolutionary city. And in the late 1700s, of course, this region was contested. Your region of the continent, those of you who live in the Fort Wayne area, and the region I represent, just across the Ohio border, around Fallen Timbers, and the British and the colonists were fighting for control. Native Americans took different sides in those battles, but the battles that surrounded Fort Wayne and Fallen Timbers are completely historic and important. And what was fought here at Fort Wayne was the choke point for control of what was then viewed as the development of the United States of America, because of the way that the St. Joseph, the Wabash, the Ohio, and the Mississippi interconnect. If you could control the waters, the movement of people through the waterways in Fort Wayne, you could manage your way all the way down the Mississippi to the Gulf. It's real. I don't think they teach this in school anymore, do they? No, they don't. But it's very important, especially when people traveled by canoe. Before there were cars, before there were planes, before there were trains, control of the continent really rested here. And if you look at the expansion of the Northwest Territory, we've lived through the 20th century where I think we sort of got spoiled. But if we look back what it took to tame a continent and to bring her to the modern world, Fort Wayne played an instrumental role. I hope you tell that history here. The title of my speech really is A Freshwater Kingdom, because I've come to you today to propose that we create the 51st state in the Union. And I'm very open to what we call it, but it would comprise that. A region that is equal to the land areas of Delaware and Maryland put together. So if Delaware and Maryland each have a state with 2 senators and some representatives, why couldn't the largest watershed in the Great Lakes be a state on its own, particularly one that has the most abundant lake of all the Great Lakes within it and the largest footprint on land in the entire Great Lakes, where 80% of the fresh water of our nation resides adjacent to us here and the other Great Lakes. It's really something to think about if you understand the world that our ancestors were discovering. Now that we've figured it out, oh my goodness, what we have here. If you think about the region that I represent, which is a little bit, we're here at Fort Wayne, which is the west side of the map there. We see where Indiana is. But then you follow it all the way east. You'll come to Toledo, the Fort to Port US 24 corridor. That's the land corridor. But there's a water corridor that others have discussed, which is the Maumee River, which is the aorta of this heart of fresh water. And it empties out into Lake Erie. Lake Erie has more fish and fauna than all the other Great Lakes combined. This is the most abundant place in the world. There is no other place like where we live. They don't teach this in school, but I defy you to find another place where this much fresh water meets this much arable land. It simply doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And when I saw Mayor Collins and his remarks, we knew him personally, and looking back, I'm sure his life was shortened by some of the pressures and the crises that he had to deal with during his brief tenure as our mayor. He had been on city council for many, many years. He'd been a captain in our police division before that. He gave his life, really, for our community. So this issue becomes personal, as well as sort of public policy. It becomes personal because you live with the people who tried to make a difference during a very, very difficult time in a region which lost a supply of fresh water for 3 days. It was surreal. You could drive down the street, go into a franchise on a Saturday, it was closed. Nothing was open. Nothing. It was like you were driving through a ghost town, except you knew that hundreds of thousands of people lived there. And then the beneficence of the American people, they brought in water by vans and trucks and church groups and Rotary group. People tried to help us. Tanker trucks came in to our hospitals. And you saw this happening. You said, this is 2014 in America? It was really the canary in the coal mine for us, and we feel a special responsibility for our region to help America find her way forward. The shortage of water was the result, as you've heard from others, of a massive algal bloom in the western part of Lake Erie. I represent all of Lake Erie's shoreline. I have the largest coastal district in the Great Lakes, but for one in Upper Michigan. And that algal bloom blocked the water intake at Toledo, which is located high in the water, and Toledo has only one water intake. Cleveland has 4. And a layer of dead and dying green algae with toxic cyanotoxins that's inside of it crept into our water system and triggered a standard where the people that operated the plant said, uh-oh, we can't send this out through the pipes in the city. The water was undrinkable, and it caused the entire event, caused untold damage to our reputation as a region, and the challenge forward still remains. And so we thank you for being concerned citizens. Margaret Mead was right. If you give me a band of people who are truly committed, we can change the world. And we are about to change the world in this part of North America. To meet the challenge for our region, our what I like to call freshwater kingdom must develop a Western Lake Erie Basin mentality, and we must found it in our minds as a virtual state. Because we have to learn how to work together, and it'll be a little bit difficult as we get into these new boundaries and learn how to work together. And I congratulate the mayor. I congratulate all of those who are involved in this rivers convening and what you are doing here. Because the water crisis that we endured not only shook our community, it also showed us in the clearest possible terms the scope and seriousness of what is required to assure our water security and the safety of our freshwater ecosystem. We were not the first community on the Great Lakes to have such an event. Several years ago, Milwaukee had cryptosporidium leak into its system, and they heard the warning bell too. Policy leaders, educators, scientists, engineers, we all need to be thinking in a bigger way about how to protect this life-giving vital resource, and there is no room for error. We were able to build the roadway between Fort Wayne and Toledo, the Fort to Port. Well, we figured out how to cooperate on that. We need to pivot off that experience to something even bigger. Serving as ranking member of what's called the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Energy and Water, we govern the money that the Army Corps of Engineers receives. And it strikes me as I go around the country to many, many communities, how easily the American people forget about what it takes to produce fresh water, because we began to take it for granted in the last century. Water is no less than the binding of life. It can be found not just in lakes and rivers, but also in the soil, and sometimes deep underground. It falls from the heavens to clean the air and the earth. We drink it from birth to death, and it fills every cell in our bodies. For some, it can be blessed and made sacred, or used to wash away sins. Water has very, very symbolic meanings too. We are bound together with all living things on this earth by water. I think, 80 or 90% of us are water. Water gives us life, it connects us to nature and to one another, and it gives us a profound reason to work together. Every community is downstream or upstream from another community. And one of the problems in not teaching geography in school anymore is young people don't even know the name of the ditch that flows through their neighborhood. They've been disconnected from the natural system that keeps us alive. The Maumee River, which we all know, flows from Fort Wayne through the heart of my hometown of Toledo and then straight into Lake Erie. It is the largest river to empty into the Great Lakes. And it is one of the most important sources of fresh water in the world. Fort Wayne itself was founded at the point where the Maumee, the St. Joseph, and the St. Mary's River converge. We are literally, in our bodies, in our communities, and in spirit, bound together by water. Since its founding, Fort Wayne has been defined by its waterways, as the mayor said. Before its founding as a fort, this area was the capital of the Miami Nation and related Algonquin tribes. In the late 1600s, French traders established a post here in what would later become Fort Miami and then Fort Wayne, and with the St. Mary's flowing from the south and the St. Joseph's flowing from the north, Fort Wayne is a major strategic nexus in all directions. The mayor was right. And believe me, it was strategic if you were traveling by canoe and you were close to the earth. This location continues to be vitally important as the site where the Maumee forms. This mighty river feeds directly into Lake Erie and supplies fish and fresh water to a vast population across our region. As a result, decisions made here will over time affect the lives of millions of others. For example, Fort Wayne and Indiana generally have been on the front lines of the battle against the Asian carp, and I thank you for that. That creature has come north from that same waterway system I referred to earlier, all the way from southern Mississippi, working its way up over 3 decades toward the Chicago Canal, and ultimately could get into the Great Lakes, which would kill our fishery. Now, at the Wabash, at Eagle Marsh, we've just been talking, the Army Corps of Engineers has placed a barrier because one of those fish or more got into the Wabash a few years ago, and we were desperately worried it was going to get into the Maumee and ultimately enter the Great Lakes. It would kill all the native fish that we know. It would eat them as it eats everything as it comes up the Mississippi River. So we are bound again in this watershed to work together to try to retain the native species that are here. The environmental DNA testing, or as they call it, eDNA, that is used to monitor the creatures in the Great Lakes was developed here at Notre Dame University, and I'm so proud of Notre Dame for that. Other universities in this region are doing similar vital work to protect the economic and ecological systems that depend on this vast watershed. There's a finite amount of water on our planet, though its form changes and shifts around the seasons. In fact, in Lake Erie, it just melted because we had huge ice plates this year. Its quantity remains the same globally. But think about this. The recent announcement of Governor Jerry Brown of California requiring 25% freshwater cutbacks across that state, which is a huge state. 25% cutback. Remind us of how current and immediate the freshwater challenge is. When I asked my colleague in the Senate, my counterpart on the Energy and Water Committee, Senator Dianne Feinstein, how I should describe their situation in California when I speak to my constituents and constituents in the Great Lakes, she forthrightly replied in less than 10 years, tell them California is becoming a desert state. Just this week, Oregon Governor Kate Brown declared a drought emergency in parts of her state due to record low snowpack levels. She described the natural and economic disaster conditions as well as higher wildfire risk and threats to agriculture and wildlife. In an era where other regions are experiencing water shortages, the choices we make as environmental stewards for the United States of America in our 51st state could be a model for our nation and the world, and indeed I believe they are. On a planet where the need for fresh water is increasing while the supply remains fixed, it behooves us to stop and consider how our precious waters and arable soils can be managed for the sake of future generations. The stresses on our water are significant and they are growing. Watershed stewardship has been a thread in the fabric of American leadership for more than a century. During his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt told Congress that forest and water problems are perhaps the most vital internal problems of the United States. Let me illustrate what a contemporary example is of how we learn to work with nature and solve real challenges. When I was elected to Congress first in 1983, the bald eagle was an endangered species. There were just 2 pairs of bald eagles that were left on Lake Erie. A decade earlier, in 1972, DDT was banned. The Clean Water Act had been passed, as citizen naturalists and environmentalists near and far came together to push for strong environmental protections. Today, there are more than 200 pairs of nesting bald eagles on Lake Erie. This year, more than 300 eaglet chicks hatched, and they were healthy. The bald eagle has been taken off the endangered species list. And I say in my speeches, literally, Lake Erie's western basin, which I've been proud to represent for many years, has given rebirth to the bald eagle across all of northern Ohio. This is the kind of result we can yield as we heal our watershed now with this new challenge. The giant accomplishment of human beings helping nature restore herself teaches us that America can achieve what she sets out to do. Lake Erie's western basin is truly blessed. This rich land, site of the former Great Black Swamp, formed as Lake Erie's glacial waters receded from as far west as here in Fort Wayne, giving rise to a productive life bowl that even hosts the Toledo area's community mascot, the mud hen, a little brown duck called the coot. This freshwater kingdom and the land around it was tiled and drained for agriculture. The fields are abundant, and I'm so proud of the people that worked on Fort to Port, because as we drove here from Toledo to Fort Wayne, one of the challenges we had was to try not to disturb the farmland, because it is the finest in the world. And I was so pleased to see that there weren't all of the different curb cuts all the way, that we did control that. We controlled access in that corridor because we were thinking not of today, but of 100 and 200 years from now, and that this land would become even more important with each passing year. The highly productive soils are especially precious in a world whose population is slated to expand at a faster and faster rate each decade. When I was born, the population of our country was 146 million. In 3/4 of a century, it has doubled to over now 300 million. And in half that time, by 2050, it is projected to rise to 500 million people. But no more land is being made, and no more water is being made, and the stresses on those systems will grow with each passing decade. That growth requires a long-term interstate, and indeed in our watershed, international connection because of Canada, with a very, very significant watershed stewardship plan. In that effort, this is our state. This is what we must focus on. Agricultural innovation and advances in the science of production have made it possible to meet our food supply needs and to export to a hungry world. However, increased production has come at a cost. Fertilizer levels have been quadrupled over the past quarter century to replenish depleted soils for higher yields and double cropping. Fertilizer composition has been altered too, sometimes eliminating ingredients like sulfur that play a role in soil and water health. For example, sulfur helps break down phosphorus, one of the nutrients that explode algae's growth. We simply must better understand soil science. Rainfall across our region has changed too. Sudden extreme downpours, what about last night, all across the Midwest, are more and more common, increasing the nutrient runoff into streams and rivers. Ohio and Indiana's climactic zones have moved up a zone, and we are now more like what Tennessee used to be. In a nation where 17 states in the arid, fire-ravaged West are facing scarcity, ours is facing a different sort of dilemma. The Western Lake Erie water shortage has passed temporarily, but the reality is that Lake Erie is still very sick. It already has a dead zone. We call it eutrophic zone, where there's no oxygen. They can't tell us exactly why. We have to muster the will and intelligence to help these systems heal. Let me take you on a journey across our watershed. Put on your hip boots. We're about to scale a shallow canyon that tilts eastward. Toledo lies at the base of an oblong bowl on its extreme eastern edge. Simply put, the water drains toward Lake Erie across a 3-state region. For example, when the St. Joseph's and St. Mary's rivers flood, or the Blanchard River in Findlay, Ohio floods, Lake Erie eventually becomes the depository for the runoff through the Maumee River. If you picture the watershed as a living, beating heart, I mentioned before, the Maumee is its aorta. That aorta is fed by major veins and smaller capillaries that form the ditches, streams, and rivers that drain into the Maumee inside this tri-state bowl, tilted toward the lake. Waterways drain down from Michigan and from Canada through the Thames River and then through the Detroit River through Lake St. Clair, eastward from Fort Wayne, northward from a region south of Findlay. Most young people in that region don't even know the rivers flow north, and then upward and across toward the lake near Sandusky. So it gushes toward the lake. Our watershed is a sponge of water, including artesian wells, underground rivers. It's unbelievable. It also has been altered by human hands by massive billion-dollar investments in a spider web of subsurface drainage tiles. And if you were to look at a map of the entire United States of America, the place that has the highest concentration of drainage tiles in the entire 50-state nation is right here in the western Lake Erie Basin. This largely man-made concentrated subsurface drainage system also happens to be the most concentrated system of tiling on our continent. When it rains anywhere across our watershed, this system acts like a superhighway, shooting the runoff into Lake Erie at a very fast pace. Now remember, rainfall in the Midwest has increased by well over 1/3 in the past quarter century. So you have all these forces converging in this 51st state. The toxin that invaded Toledo's water system is the end product of a massive watershed runoff problem. Just fixing Toledo's water plant with more filters won't fix the watershed problem. A lot of the reporters go to the water plant because they can find it. But actually, that's the end of the process. What's going on out here is much more dynamic. We have to fix the tri-state feeder system that is clogging the arteries of our heart and threatening cardiac arrest in our lake. Our tri-state watershed embraces over 11,000 square miles. And I mentioned larger than the states of Maryland and Delaware put together, or a land area larger than maybe 1/4 of the state of Ohio. So it's a big area. When water moves inside this watershed, it sweeps up with it natural sediments and nutrients from the land and all the byproducts of human activity: sewage, stormwater, industrial runoff, agricultural runoff, animal waste, commercial fertilizer, a witch's brew of its own making. Watershed issues take many forms. from thousands of leaking septic systems to urban storm runoff, dozens of combined sewer overflows, animal manure spread on winter snows. As we found out in Toledo, the clock is ticking. Toxic algal blooms and other water contaminants have become a global health threat. They represent an enormously expensive treatment challenge for cities throughout our country that simply don't have the money to pay for what it takes to fix it. So fixing what's happening here is a multi-billion-dollar challenge that requires more than local coordination. We need an interstate collaboration and coordination that spans public agencies and private and not-for-profit organizations. We have to look for public-private partnerships because this is in the interest of the private sector to have fresh water, and we need to find those new mechanisms. Frankly, I believe we need new federal financing arrangements involving both the public sector and the private sector to lower the interest rates and extend the terms of water investments across the many communities in our watershed to make them more affordable to the local communities. If America could build the Hoover Dam, certainly we can figure this out a century later. Now, in looking toward the future and how to focus our energies, good science is the first step in the long-term stewardship of our freshwater supply. That's why we've worked for nearly 3 decades now to bring precious federal dollars to places like the Lake Erie Research Center, domiciled at the University of Toledo. Science being done at this center and by many collaborating universities across this region, as well as state and federal agencies doing similar work throughout the country, gives us the compass and the map we need to move forward with public policy to ensure public safety, water security, and critically, crisis response strategies. Many communities across the United States have organizations like yours that can help strengthen our watershed science capability. Federally, we are coordinating our work even with NASA with flyovers over the lake, the U.S. Geological Survey that's here today, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service of the United States Department of Agriculture that's well represented here today, and we need them all, not just during a crisis, but to lay out a coherent scientific basis for action. The Corps of Engineers came to me recently in Washington and said, Congresswoman, you know, we think what you need out there is some type of flood control project. I said, well, you know what, I'm glad you finally woke up because I've been looking at you for a long time. Years ago, I went to them 25 years ago and I said, I want you to build me a lake. And they laughed. And they said, where? I said, well, I think it's got to be somewhere near Defiance, Ohio. I said, I'm not sure, but I got too much water coming at the city that I represent, Toledo at that time. I need to store some of it. I got to hold it somewhere because it's coming at us too fast and all the manhole covers in our downtown are blowing off as the floodwaters just come into us. So we've got to figure out how to divert some of this and hold it. And they said, well, we can't build a lake there. And I said, why not? They said, it's too flat. I said, well, find me another solution. You're the experts on what to do with water, so help me out. You could tame the Mississippi, you could build the Hoover Dam, you could do all these things. Help me out. Help me out here. We've got a great problem, too much fresh water. And we've got to process it so it's clean when it comes toward us. But our plants are old, and we've got to hold some of it back. So I present the challenge to you. If you were to say to the Corps, this is the project I think is really needed in this watershed, what would we say it would be? I and others have worked for years to establish the Western Lake Erie Basin Partnership as a volunteer effort to become a national model for watershed management for the 21st century, and it's well on its way to doing that. And this kind of model is receiving more widespread attention as it receives financial support, for example, through the recent Farm Bill, and a provision called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or the RCCP, directed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and their Natural Resource Conservation Service. In January of this year, Secretary Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, announced that $17 million in federal investment in applications that support phosphorus reduction in the Western Lake Erie Basin would be applied. The active participation and leadership of the state of Indiana and its agencies and organizations is one reason that our region's application across this 51st state met the USDA gold standard of cooperation. The RCCP program will leverage over $36 million in private and not-for-profit investment as well. And the initiative covers all of our 3 states, showing the broad regional participation needed for real progress. This kind of big thinking across the 51st state is a vital part of our being successful in meeting the challenge at hand, and it demands a watershed mentality. As the ranking Democrat on the House Energy and Water Subcommittee, I've proposed several legislative alternatives to expedite a solution to cleaning up the waters and, frankly, the soils. The solutions rely on 3 pillars. I've mentioned science, a second one is citizen participation and action, and thirdly, a management structure that spans this entire region. Let me just tick off a few ideas in each of those categories. The first step is to strengthen the science, and that's where the federal government comes in, providing advisory guidance for testing and treating toxins like microcystin in our drinking water. We need a standard for what is clean water, and we need universal testing protocols for the algal contaminants. Believe it or not, those do not exist. We also need a way of testing in this watershed at thousands of points of light. We need testing labs here in our region to allow us to test whatever we find, and lakefront communities and riverfront communities shouldn't have to send those samples far away, which happened in the Toledo situation, to Cincinnati or somewhere up in Minnesota and waste hours and hours and hours of getting real results. We need better science, and we need it faster. Communities in our watershed along Lake Erie truly need for those labs and that equipment to be here very close to us. Then secondly, in terms of citizen action and developing that watershed mentality as a 51st state, this is an awesome task. But when you think about it, at Disney World, we have the Magic Kingdom, right? And that's in people's minds, the Magic Kingdom part of Disney World. We have the Animal Kingdom. There are things we say, we work together, and we have the Kingdom of Heaven. We can surely have a freshwater kingdom. And we can kind of adopt that as our modus operandi as we proceed. And an active and engaged public is so interested in helping us, but they need to be directed to where their efforts make the most difference. Last year we had a reporter, a very well-known one, come from one of our major stations in the Toledo area. He came to Fort Wayne, and he got in a boat, and he took vials with him, and his story was about how to sample the water, and then he was going to go down the river, and he did all the way back to Toledo, and he took all of his samples, and he took them to the lab, and they told him he'd collected them all incorrectly, and therefore he couldn't get any results. So there are citizens out there that need to be directed who can help us in broadcasting results and in informing, but they too need to be helped and properly directed. I've talked to him about how to do this in this fiscal year. The watershed mentality and citizen action that are necessary have to encompass 1,313,000 acres in my own district, but this much broader region of the entire watershed. And people are looking for ways to be helpful. Think about where you live. If you have a street that has a storm sewer on it, you can think of a way to filter what is going into that storm sewer where the nutrients come out and they're held, whether it's a rain garden, whether it's certain types of bags that are put around there that grow flowers or whatever that can serve as filter strips. Farmers out in the country, their drainage ditches can become catchment ponds for nutrients that can be returned to fields. The vast amounts of animal manure out there, actually in our watershed, 43,000 train car loads at a minimum annually of manure produced across the watershed, need more careful management and frankly a higher economic use for them than just spreading on the land. And if it's dewatered and mixed and pasteurized to a certain level, what would be a higher economic use for that activity than for what it is currently used for in many places? These are some scientific challenges that demand answers. Let me give you a couple other statistics. There are 2 million people who live in our 51st state, but over 10 million animals, and that number is increasing. The amount of human fertilizer generated each year would fill 247 boxcars, but for animal manure, which totals over 12 billion pounds annually, I mentioned to you that those fill over 43,000 boxcar loads annually. That's over 170 times more than from humans. So we have to be mindful of the creatures that live in this watershed with us and how we manage their output. For commercial fertilizer, there are a total of over 1 billion pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium placed on the land, and that amounts to about 3,700 boxcar loads annually. The question is, how much do the plants absorb? And we don't know. And how much material works its way to Lake Erie? And we don't know. We need better science. At all levels of government, elected officials have a role to play. In Ohio last month, the governor signed a bill that will help alleviate nutrient runoff by banning the spread of livestock manure on frozen or rain-soaked ground or when heavy rain is in the immediate forecast. The Ohio law puts an end to the practice of open lake dumping of dredged materials within the next 5 years, and the Corps of Engineers is screaming. We are going to win that fight. There's an old expression, you can't fool Mother Nature, and I would add, we shouldn't try. Please hear me when I say this, as my community has learned it from hard experience. We must find the truth about our watershed, face it together, and act resolutely. To that end, I believe that the Great Lakes watershed, and really every vital U.S. watershed, needs a more formal structure. I'm struggling to draft what that is. One form of this could be a federally authorized tri-state coordinating and financing instrument that can set goals and achieve them. We would become a virtual state. This crisis is too significant to punt along. Years ago, the Tennessee Valley Authority was created over an 8-state region to aid their development. More recently, the Everglades and the Chesapeake Bay created organizations to meet their particular environmental challenge. The Bureau of Reclamation has served 17 western states in the Desert West for 100 years. The Great Lakes has no such mechanism. Isn't that amazing? Such a public-private partnership could aim to lift some of the management and infrastructure financing burdens from communities trying to do the right thing. And I think we need to push the edge of the envelope on this concept. To succeed then, we need science, we need one another and citizen action, and we need a coordinated organizational effort empowered and capable to meet the needs of fresh water in this 51st state. Our futures are bound together by water, and the challenges of the 21st century will require our cooperation. I will end with a quote that sits above the speaker's dais in the House of Representatives, which is one of my very favorite, from Daniel Webster. Let us develop the resources of our land, call forth its powers, build up its institutions, and ask whether we, in our time and generation, may not perform something to be remembered. This is our moment. Thank you for your attention and for being here today.